Another individual significant to the history of unions was James McNamara. He was a member of the International Association of Bridge and Structural Iron Workers Union, and he pled guilty to the bombing of the building housing in the Los Angeles Times on the 1st of October in 1910. Company towns, in which one large corporation was dominant, sprung up across the country with the increased industrialism. In these towns, prices for housing and food were often exorbitant, as their isolation forced the inhabitants to buy company-sponsored products. Immigrants often populated these places, maintaining their communities as best they could with the grueling work hours. Since male workers often spent the entire day doing hard, dangerous factory labor, women would maintain the home, raise the children, and boost the family income in what ways they could. Gardening offered a supplement to the family's food, and sewing provided an occupation that paid reasonably well. Though women's daily lives were extremely dull, men were often cut short by alcoholism and factory incidents.
People die.
One of the most well-known corporations that dominated company towns was Colorado Fuel and Iron. In 1913, Ludlow, Colorado, a large strike against this company occurred, and, led by the United Mine Workers, thousands of miners and their families moved out of company towns and lived in tent colonies. John D. Rockefeller, the owner of CFI, employed armed guards to surround the tents. Fighting broke out, and the troops decimated the workers, burning their homes to the ground and slaughtering their families. The angry strikers attacked the mines, and the rebellion lasted 10 days, up until President Wilson ordered the army into the region. The Ludlow massacre shocked the public into protest, and across the nation, demonstrations and rallies against the CFI and John Rockefeller came into effect. Another example of a very famous company town would be Chicago, in the meat-packing industry. Upton Sinclair's The Jungle references this with horror and was also an example of muckraking. The tumult of the era was influential on all aspects of every walk of life, but none was more evident than its immense impact on governmental structures. Progressivism was the hallmark of the time, changing the way politicians presented their platforms, organized their policy, and expanded the power of the federal government. From the urban machine reform town hall politics to the national stage, progressivism changed the very way people organized their lives. It all started with Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt developed several programs like the Sherman Antitrust Act over his 2 terms that put a progressive spin on responding to concerns about the domination of big businesses over all the American life. Trust busting made Roosevelt famous for breaking up large consolidations through the use of extensive regulation, for example, in the famous Supreme Court case Northern Securities versus the United States, in which Roosevelt's reputation was secured when the court ruled that a near takeover of all long-distance rail lines by J.P. Morgan was unconstitutional. In regards to the expansion of government power to regulate and the dismantling of several large monopolies, Roosevelt was highly successful. His corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, for example, greatly expanded the power of the U.S. government to protect and preserve all of the countries in the Western Hemisphere. Despite these successes in government expansion and increased regulation, Roosevelt's label as a progressive is often disputed by those who call upon the evidence that big corporations profited under the new regulatory politics, and oftentimes the new laws put smaller companies out of business. However, dismantling the institution of big business was never Roosevelt's intent. In fact, he accepted that large corporations is an inherent piece of American economy. He did not want to tear down big businesses, he just wanted to ensure the right of the federal government to regulate corporate behavior, and that is what he did. Through the passage of the Hepburn, Pure Food and Drug, and Meat Inspection Acts, Roosevelt's success as a trust buster was well received by the people who had been calling for a change to the lopsided economic system for some time. This support manifested in cartoons by these artists such as Udo Kepler in his piece concerning a growing menace. These generally positive views of Roosevelt and his policies by both citizens and businesses were the result of Roosevelt's square deal platform, which attempted to not favor any specific group of citizens, but rather treat them all equally. Multiple scholars have argued that while Roosevelt made great strides in terms of trust building, he all but ignored the plight of specific minority groups. For example, not taking action against the growing environment of racially challenged violence in the South. On the other hand, some scholars argue that Roosevelt was still incredibly progressive, particularly involving environmentalism. Roosevelt was a big believer in government regulation and protection of the remaining wildlands of the United States, and his creation of the U.S. Forest Service reflected his ideals. But when the environment became a national policy issue, 2 very distinct opinion groups developed: conservationists, who made up Roosevelt's administration and wanted to find a balance between conserving wild lands and opening up space for commercial development, and preservationists, who wanted to protect wild lands from any development or settling. The conflict between the 2 groups reached its peak during the battle over Hetchley, a valley that conservationists wished to dam and use for hydroelectric power, and preservationists wished to protect. The resulting battle in Congress saw the conservationists claim victory, but the preservationists gain a spot on the national stage. However, the conservationists still won out in the end with the development of the Newlands Reclamation Act, another progressive Roosevelt policy that gave the federal government jurisdiction in regulating water sources. Progressive government did not end after Roosevelt's retirement, but it came close. After Roosevelt decided to retire, William Taft won the election of 1908 and took over the office of the presidency as a Republican. His views, however, conflicted with the views of progressives nationwide and resulted in the split of the Republican Party and a series of bitter political fights. Roosevelt decided to challenge Taft for the 1912 ticket with his new nationalism platform, a platform containing an activist president and a strong regulatory federal government. But the election of 1912 became increasingly more chaotic when Woodrow Wilson, an esteemed reformer, joined the ticket as a Democratic progressive and took aim at Roosevelt with the creation of the New Freedom Platform, which still favored progressive reform but also advocated for a smaller government and less regulation. To top it all off, the rapidly rising Socialist Party nominated Eugene Debs, who offered an extremely radical platform to the mix. In the end, though, the election of 1912, often seen as the first modern election, elected Wilson to the office, with him easily winning the majority of districts. And though Wilson had competed against Roosevelt, he followed his methods of policy once in office. With the passage of the tariff-reducing Underwood-Simmons Act, the Union-protecting Clayton Antitrust Act, and the creation of the Permanent Regulatory Agency, the Federal Trade Commission, Wilson continued bringing the national ideals of progressive reform to the office. The scent of war in the East, however, saw Wilson's presidency as the close of an incredible era of radicalism and reform and progressivism.